Hi. In the last segment we were discussing all the layout for the Hawaiian Tenor Ukulele Neck. In this segment I'm going to describe as best as I can how I try to make a neck. I'm not going to demonstrate, I'm just going to talk about it, and I'm going to discuss a lot of the tools because tools are an important part of making a good neck. And most of your problems can be easily, 90% of all the problems in woodworking and instrument making can be solved by using the right tool for the job. And good tools at that. If you use poor quality tools, you're going to get poor results. And as anybody who's gone to a yard sale or a flea market sale or bought some inexpensive tools found out very quickly, they spend more time fixing the tool than actually using it. Now in the last segment, when we laid out our lines over here from the nut to the heel, typically what I will do is I will cut this out on the bandsaw and then start the carving process. And what I do is I'll show on this over here, I'll take this part over here has been carved more like a C, this 8-string tenor ukulele neck, and one of the tools that I use for roughing out the neck is a draw knife. Not any kind of a drawing knife, a kind that is basically set up for carving. This one's a Swedish frost tool. It's got about a 4.5-inch blade and it's excellent for carving taking off the bulk of the neck around the edges of this Hawaiian Tenor Ukulele Neck. So this is an important tool. If you don't have one, that's okay, no problem. You can also do that on a bandsaw. You can mark your lines, preferably 1/8 of an inch outside your edge, and then chop away the waste, cut away the waste using a small bandsaw. Another tool that I find really good for ukulele making is a set of spoke shaves. These are Stanley 151s for gradually roughing in the shape and the profile that you want on your neck. There's two Stanley 151s here and a Boker German 51 spoke shave. The 51 is actually has a tight throat on it for taking finer shavings, and the Stanley ones have a bigger mouth to take bigger shavings with. Also, I've got a Marples old-fashioned boxwood spoke shave, which has got a slight curve along its length, and that's also good for carving the neck. You could also use a surf form. My problem with the surf form is that it leaves great big chunks and a lot of big scratches, and you're going to wind up doing a lot of sanding if you use a surf form tool. Another tool I like to use, especially for working around on the back profile of the heel and the inside part of the heel, are these fine rasps made in Hungary, I believe. I think they come out through Germany. They're violin makers' tools, and this one is a Herdem number 5, which is a finer rasp, and a double-ended oval one, a Herdem number 4, and a smooth one. These are also very handy, especially for cutting in outside the neck, the back end of the neck over here near the headstock, underneath the heel, and to cut this profile over here. Works very well. So those are some handy tools that I use to carve the neck with. Another tool I strongly recommend you get is a couple of adjustable mouth block planes. This is a cheap one made in India that you have to spend a bit of time on to soup it up, but still works pretty well. Here's an old Stanley number 60.5, I believe, with the adjustable mouth, and it's set up with a Hawk blade. The Hawk was replaced the Stanley that was in there, and it gives a much better shaving, and the edges held a lot longer. I suggest also for honing your blades, you have a diamond stone, which quickly brings down the bevel to the desired angle. For layout tools, you might use something like this to lay out your templates. I also strongly recommend a good sharp quality knife. This is a 3/4 inch Hawk double bevel blade, and I use that a lot for cutting in on the inside corners over here, the transition between the heel and the neck, and the transition between the headstock and the neck. It's very good for getting into the really tight corners. Another very useful tool is an engineer square. This little 4-inch engineer square is used quite a bit to lay out the neck, the heel stock, and all your center lines. The more accuracy you can get in your work, the better off you're going to be. So either a 4 or 6-inch engineer square is very, very useful. Here's another little tool that I made. It's basically a block made out of 3/4 inch plywood, flattened on one end, and I always use it to measure the back end of the taper from the front of the nut to the back to make sure that everything is in alignment. Typically you're going to get lumps and bumps all along, and by constantly referencing back to a square block of wood, you can see where all your high spots are. So I would flatten one end and keep checking it as you're working along to make sure that you have a nice straight even neck with no lumps and bumps. And I'd go over it with my hand, check carefully, feel off all the lumps and bumps, and then come back again and check on all 3 angles back and forth this way. Another useful tool is here's an old-fashioned English Moore and Wright metric and American size 12-inch ruler, good for checking to make sure you're flat over here, flat over here. I also recommend a small little tiny hammer, which is good for adjusting your plane blades. You can tap them out either way. This is a Chinese hammer, purchased at the dollar store for $1. Very, very handy. You don't need to buy one of those really expensive hammers, which cost $20 or $25. If you have a dollar store in your neighborhood, this is an excellent tool and an excellent buy. Comes with a white oak handle. Another thing you might want to invest in, is a good sharpening stone. I have an old black hard Arkansas, but if you have access to Japanese stones, they cut much faster than this. But either way, whether you use it 1,000 grit, 3,000, 6,000, or a hard black Arkansas, you got to remember, you have to have sharp tools in order to do good work. If you have dull tools, you're going to rip the wood, you're going to have problems, and you'll cause you no end of worry and frustration. So learn to sharpen your tools as best as you can. Another thing that's handy to have is a small tape measure. This one's a Stanley that I've had for about 15 years. It reads out in both metric and inch. Since I'm constantly switching between the two all the time, I find it very, very handy. Also, another thing you might want to have is have plenty of tape on hand to tape things off when you want to tape one end from the other so that you can see what you're doing or to lay things out properly. Other tools that are handy but not necessarily important is I made this little sanding file. It's basically a piece of 3/4 inch plywood with 100 grit of sandpaper. I can use that to sand out small parts if you don't have access to a belt or disc sander. And last but not least, in order to measure all your parts, a luthier's dial gauge is an extremely handy tool to have. They're very expensive. You can try making your own, but it helps to use this tool, especially when you're laying out your backs, tops, and your sides. Thank you, and if you need more information, please contact us at www.ateliertommy.com.